The rain came hard, and sudden blowing sideways across the valley, rattling the shutters on my cabin like a warning. I was halfway to closing the door when I caught the sound hooves cutting through the mud at a desperate pace, drawing nearer. No one rode into these hills without reason, especially not in weather like this. A shadow broke through the curtain of rain, swaying in the saddle, barely holding on. When the horse stumbled and the rider slipped sideways, I could see she was a woman cloaked in dark foreign robes that clung heavy to her frame. She raised her face toward me, rain streaming from her lashes, and called for shelter before her voice was swallowed by the wind. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe. If you've ever found yourself faced with a choice you couldn't turn away from. I was born on this stretch of land, a place most folks passed by without a second glance, too rugged for farming, too far from town for convenience. My father worked cattle and mended fences until his hands turned to leather. My mother tended the home sewing by lamplight, reading scripture at night and keeping us steady through the lean years. They raised me to believe a man's worth was measured by his word, his work, and how he treated those in need. We traded more on trust than on coin back then, each neighbor watching out for the next, even when the miles between homesteads were wide. By the time I took over the ranch, the world was changing fast. The railroad brought strangers with city manners and money to spend, folks who saw the land as something to divide and sell, not tend and keep. Land agents rolled through with their fine coats and clever words, pressing homesteaders to sign away what their families had built. I kept to myself and my herd, making the long ride into town only when supplies ran low. Crowded streets and polished storefronts made me uneasy, like I'd wandered into someone else's world. Then came the day that split my life into two pieces, before and after. Raiders rode in while I was away looking for trouble and found my wife Sarah and our little girl Emma instead. The cabin, the land, even the cattle could be replaced, but they couldn't. When they were gone, the place I'd called home turned into nothing but walls and roof. I sold off most of the herd, let the fences fall where they leaned, and let the seasons pass without marking them. 3 years went by that way, each one colder than the last, even in summer. That stormy evening with the sky gone near black and the smell of wet earth rising from the ground, I thought I had my life measured out, no surprises, no risks. But as the stranger's horse fought the wind at my fence line, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, the pull to step outside the shelter I'd built. The woman swayed in her saddle, her hands white-knuckled on the reins, and for a moment I stood there in the doorway, caught between the life I knew and the one that might begin if I let her in. The wind drove the rain against the porch in hard slanting sheets as I stepped toward the edge of the steps. The rider was near the fence now, the horse's sides heaving, its hooves slipping in the sodden earth. I could see her more clearly, a young woman, her face pale under the shadow of a wet hood, both hands gripping the reins as if they were the only thing keeping her upright. The animal shied from the wind, rearing just enough to throw her sideways into the mud. I stood still for a breath, rain running down my collar, watching her struggle to get to her knees. By the time I reached her, the horse had backed against the fence, eyes rolling. She didn't cry out again, just swayed where she knelt, one palm pressed to her forehead. Up close, I could see the dark fabric clinging to her frame. Wasn't the rough cotton or leather worn by most women in these parts, but heavy robes cinched at the waist, torn where they'd caught on the saddle. "Easy now," I said, my voice rough from disuse. Her head lifted enough for me to meet her eyes, dark, steady despite the pain. "Please. Shelter." She managed the word, catching on a faint accent I couldn't place. I hesitated only a moment before lifting her into my arms. She was lighter than I expected, rainwater soaking her clothes and my shirt. The door banged against the wall as I stepped inside, the warmth from the fire brushing against our cold, wet skin. I set her gently on the bed, the one I hadn't shared with anyone in 3 years, and reached for the lamp. Her hood had fallen back, revealing straight black hair plastered to her cheeks and a gash along her temple. From the cupboard, I took a clean cloth and the bottle of carbolic, setting them on the table beside her. She watched me as I cleaned the wound, flinching only when the cloth touched the raw edge. "What's your name?" I asked, binding the cut with a strip of linen. "Sister Naomi Takeda," she said softly. "I was traveling to the mission beyond the ridge when the storm caught me." Her voice carried a stillness that didn't match the tremble of her hands. I leaned back on the stool, studying her face. "Traveling alone in this weather's no small thing. There are children there," she replied, her gaze steady. "They've lost their families to raids and sickness. I was sent to help care for them." The words settled in the room, bringing with them a familiar ache. I said nothing, returning to my work in silence. Her eyes followed my movements, and after a moment she said, "You live here alone?" It wasn't a question. "That's how I like it," I told her, tightening the bandage. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. "No. That's how you survive it." I kept my hands busy with the bandage ties, but her words sat heavy in the air. I fetched her a blanket and eased it over her shoulders. "Rest here until the storm passes. In the morning you can ride on." She nodded but didn't lie back. "It's not just the weather that brought me here," she said after a pause. "The mission heard about a man living beyond the settlement. A man who'd shut himself away from the world." My jaw tightened, the memory of the last time a stranger had pried into my life rising in my chest. "You think I'm that man?" I asked. She didn't flinch. "I think you've carried something heavy for too long." Her voice was calm, without judgment. "I've seen it before." I stood, turning toward the fire, letting the crackle of the wood fill the space between us. "You should sleep," I said. "The rain will ease by dawn." For a while, the only sounds were the wind against the eaves and the hiss of the fire. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, 5 years ago, I was to be married. I called it off for reasons I thought were right at the time. 2 weeks later, he took his own life. I turned to look at her, the lamplight catching the grief that still lived in her eyes. I joined the order to serve others, hoping God might forgive me. But guilt isn't something you can work away. It stays until you choose to forgive yourself. I moved back to the chair, the weight of her words drawing me in despite my better judgment. "And have you?" I asked. "I'm learning," she answered simply. "Every person I help teaches me something about grace." The fire popped, and in the glow of that small room, I understood that she carried her own burden, different from mine, but heavy all the same. I don't know what made me speak, but the words came before I could stop them. They were killed because of me. Raiders came for me, found my wife and daughter instead. She didn't offer comfort or deny the truth. She only nodded her eyes, holding mine, and said, "Tell me about them." It had been years since anyone had asked me that, years since I'd allowed myself to remember them alive. Sarah had a laugh that could turn heads clear across a churchyard. I began slowly, loud without shame. And Emma? She was 4, stubborn as they come. Said she wanted to grow up to be a horse, not just ride one. The memory pulled the edge from my voice for the first time in a long while. Sister Naomi listened without interruption, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "They were happy because you loved them," she said when I paused. "The raiders could take their lives, but not what you gave them while they lived." I stood restless under the weight of the moment, but her words stayed with me. Outside, the rain began to soften the wind, losing its edge. Inside, the air between us felt changed. She looked stronger than when I'd carried her, and the color back in her cheeks. But there was something else there, a steadiness, as if she'd decided on a course she meant to see through. "We'll speak more in the morning," I told her, but she shook her head. "Come with me to the mission. They need someone who understands loss." Someone who can show them that surviving doesn't mean giving up hope. I didn't answer. The fire popped again, and through the window, the clouds were beginning to break. I knew sleep wouldn't come easy that night. Her offer hung in the room like the scent of rain on fresh earth, impossible to ignore. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool, the grass heavy with water. Sunlight broke through in wide bands, lighting the valley in gold. Sister Naomi was already awake, seated at the small table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. Her bandage was neat, and the swelling at her temple had eased, though the bruise was darkening along her cheek. She glanced toward the window where my horse stood tied, restless to be moving. "It's a good day for riding," she said. "If you're willing to see the mission, I'll show you the way." I had told her the night before that she'd ride on without me, but I found myself clearing my plate and reaching for my coat. "I'll see you there," I said finally, though I wasn't sure what made the words leave my mouth. We saddled the horses in silence, the leather creaking and the scent of wet earth all around. The trail led out past the split-rail fence, winding between the low hills. Puddles reflected the sky, and the air carried the faint tang of cedar. Naomi rode with an easy seat, though I noticed how she kept her chin lifted, eyes scanning the distance as if she knew how quickly the land could turn against you. By midday, the hills opened into a broad basin, and the mission came into view. Low adobe buildings clustered around a chapel whose bell tower caught the sun. Gardens grew in neat rows along one side, and smoke drifted from a stone chimney. The sound of children's voices carried faintly, neither carefree nor silent, but somewhere in between. An older man stepped from the chapel as we approached, his hair silver, his shoulders still broad despite the years. "Father Matthew Colton," Naomi called, raising a hand in greeting. He crossed the yard with a smile that deepened the lines around his eyes. "We were worried when the storm came through," he said, then turned his gaze to me. "And you've brought someone." "Boone Slater," Naomi said simply. "He's come to help." His handshake was firm, his look steady, as if he'd been expecting this moment for longer than I knew. "Any friend of Sister Naomi is welcome here," he said, and led us toward the shaded side of the yard, where several children had gathered to watch. They stood close together, their eyes wary, clothes patched and boots worn thin. One boy, no more than 7, stepped forward. "Can you fix things?" he asked. "The barn roof leaks." I nodded. "I can fix things," I said. "What else needs work?" That opened the way for a chorus of quiet requests, fences to mend chickens, to pen a saddle that needed stitching. Father Matthew excused himself to see to the kitchen, and Naomi knelt to speak with a small girl whose braids hung uneven. I walked with the boy to the barn, its boards weathered silver by years of sun. He fetched tools from a narrow shed while I climbed the ladder to the roof. The shingles were loose where the wind had lifted them, and before long I had the hammer swinging, the sound echoing through the yard. From up there I could see Naomi moving among the children, her steps unhurried, her words drawing shy smiles. When a girl scraped her knee on a loose board, Naomi cleaned the cut and tied a cloth around it with the same care she'd shown me the night before. The child ran off moments later, limping just enough to keep the bandage in sight of her friends. By the time the repairs were done, the sun had shifted toward late afternoon. The children gathered under a large cottonwood, passing tin plates, as Naomi and an older boy brought out food. She waved me over, and I took a seat on the bench beside her. Across the yard, Father Matthew leaned against the chapel rail, his arms folded, watching the scene with a quiet satisfaction. "They'll get used to you," Naomi said. "They've seen too many come and go." I looked at the faces around the table, the guarded glances and the careful laughter. The ache in my chest was still there, but it was different now. Less like a wound, more like a scar that had learned to stretch without breaking. Father Matthew joined us, lowering himself onto the bench with a sigh. "I've prayed for help for these children for months," he said. "Seems my prayers were answered in the shape of a rancher who knows his way around a hammer." I managed a small smile. "I can stay a while," I told him the words, surprising me even as I said them. Naomi's eyes met mine, steady and sure. "As long as you need to," she said. The children began clearing plates, and the yard filled with the sound of tin clinking and benches scraping on the dirt. The sun threw long shadows from the chapel across the garden rows, and for the first time in years, I found myself picturing a tomorrow that wasn't empty. As the light faded, the wind shifted, bringing with it the smell of rain from somewhere beyond the ridge. Naomi glanced toward the horizon, her expression unreadable. "Weather's changing again," she said quietly. I followed her gaze, wondering what else might be riding in with those clouds. Father Matthew asked me to ride the perimeter fence with him the next morning. The air was cool and smelled of damp sage, the grass still slick from the storm 2 days before. Naomi had already left for the garden with a pair of older girls to work the rows, her voice carrying softly as they walked. I saddled my horse, feeling the leather creak under my weight as I swung into the seat. The fence line ran a good mile beyond the gardens, following the rise of a low ridge before dipping into open grassland. Matthew rode steady beside me, reins loose in his hands, his eyes moving over the posts and rails as if counting each one. "We've had trouble out here before," he said after a while. "Not often, but enough to keep watch." His tone carried no fear, just the weight of someone who had seen too much to be careless. About halfway round, we came to a section where the top rail hung loose, one end split clean through. I dismounted and set my gloves against it, testing the wood. "Weather didn't do this," I said. "Cut clean with a blade." Matthew nodded once, his mouth a thin line. "I noticed it yesterday. Thought it best we see it together." The ground showed the faint press of hoof prints leading off toward the tree line. We followed the tracks a short way before they disappeared into the grass. No sense in chasing shadows, so we turned back to the mission. Children were gathering near the chapel steps. When we returned, the younger ones carrying kindling, while the older boys hauled water from the well. Naomi was in the middle of them, her hands moving quickly as she tied a strip of cloth around a boy's wrist. He grinned when she finished and ran off to join the others. She looked up as we approached. "Fence trouble?" she asked. I told her what we'd found. Her brow furrowed, but she only said, "I'll make sure the children stay close to the yard." There was no panic in her voice, just a quiet firmness that made the younger ones listen without question. The rest of the day passed in steady work. I repaired the split rail while 2 boys held the posts steady. They watched closely, asking about the tools, the best way to drive a nail without bending it. By late afternoon, the fence stood solid again, and the 3 of us walked back together. The sun was low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pale gold. Inside the chapel, the evening light fell across the worn benches and simple altar. Naomi was there with a small group, teaching them a hymn. The voices were uneven, but the sound filled the room with something I hadn't felt in years. Something that stayed with me even after the last note faded. When the lesson ended, Matthew joined me by the door. "The mission survives because people choose to stay when it would be easier to walk away," he said. "The question is always how much they're willing to risk to keep it going." His gaze was steady, but I knew he wasn't just talking about himself. That night I sat outside under the wide, clear sky. The wind had shifted again, carrying the faint smell of smoke from somewhere beyond the ridge. It wasn't close enough to see the source, but it didn't belong to any campfire from the mission. Naomi stepped out onto the porch, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "You smell it too?" she said quietly. I nodded, watching the dark line of hills. Neither of us spoke after that. The air felt heavy, the kind that made you check your tack and keep your rifle close. Somewhere out there, someone was moving, and it wasn't the weather we needed to be ready for. The smell of smoke still lingered on the breeze the next morning. It wasn't heavy enough to choke the air, but it carried a sharper edge than campfire wood. Father Matthew had sent 2 of the older boys into the garden, telling them to keep their eyes on the ridge while they worked. Naomi moved between the rows with them, her hat brim low, pausing every so often to scan the horizon. I took a walk along the north edge of the property, where the fence met a dry wash. The ground here was hard-packed, but near the bank I spotted fresh sign, 3 separate sets of hoof prints, all moving in from the hills. They cut across the wash and vanished into the grass toward the outbuildings. Crouching, I could see the deeper impressions where one horse had carried more than a rider's weight. Whoever they were, they had come close enough to see the mission in daylight. When I got back, Matthew was mending harness leather on the chapel steps. I told him what I'd found. His jaw set as he listened, his hands still working the awl. "Could be drifters passing through," he said. "Could be someone deciding what's worth taking." He didn't look up, but I saw his knuckles whiten around the strap. By midday the air had warmed, but that edge of smoke came stronger from the ridge. Naomi and I hauled water from the well for the garden, the bucket handles biting into our palms. She kept her voice low. "If trouble comes, these children can't just scatter into the hills. They need someone ready to hold the line." She looked at me then, not as a guest or a stranger, but as someone she was counting on. After the noon meal, I asked 2 of the older boys, Sam and Caleb, to help me shore up the barn. We stacked extra feed sacks against the walls, checked the hinges on the big doors, and made sure the loft ladder could be pulled up if needed. They didn't ask why. Out here, you learn not to waste time on questions you can already answer yourself. Toward evening, Matthew gathered us in the chapel. The children sat on the benches, their eyes following every word. He spoke plain and steady, telling them to keep to the main yard until further notice to stay within sight of an adult. Naomi moved down the aisle as he talked, resting a hand on a shoulder here, meeting a gaze there. Her calm was a stronger anchor than any warning. When the meeting broke, I stepped outside into the cooling air. The sun was dropping behind the ridge, turning the sky the color of burnished copper. A rider appeared at the far edge of the yard, his horse lathered from a hard push. He pulled up near the chapel steps, hat low against the light. "Evening," he said, swinging down stiffly. "Name's Owen Carter. Passed a camp about 5 miles back. 3 men rough-looking, with a string of horses and a wagon. Fire was high, and they weren't making any effort to hide it." His eyes flicked toward the children gathering in the doorway. "Figured you ought to know." Matthew thanked him and offered water for his horse. I stayed quiet, watching Naomi take in the news. She didn't flinch, but her hands folded tighter around the shawl at her shoulders. The light was fading fast, and the first cool breath of night carried that same smoke smell stronger now. As Owen led his horse toward the trough, Matthew turned to me. "We'll need to keep watch tonight," he said. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the resolve in it. Naomi met my eyes, and without a word, I knew I'd be on the ridge before the moon was up. The moon rose bright over the ridge, laying silver light across the yard. Owen Carter had taken his bedroll to the barn loft, saying he'd sleep lighter there. Father Matthew kept to the chapel lantern burning in the window as a signal to any riders coming in from the trail. Naomi moved quietly among the buildings, checking latches and pulling the smaller children inside. I saddled my horse and rode up the slope beyond the garden. From there I could see the low country spread out in shadows, the line of hills to the north and the dark cut of the wash we'd inspected days before. The smell of smoke was stronger, drifting down on the breeze. I stayed there, letting my eyes adjust, scanning for movement. It was near midnight when I caught a faint glint where moonlight touched metal. 3 figures sat mounted on the far edge of the basin, still enough to pass for stumps if you didn't know to look. One shifted, and the shape of a rifle was clear against his shoulder. They weren't camped. They were watching. I eased my horse back down the slope and tied him behind the shed. In the chapel, Matthew was kneeling by the front pew. He stood when I stepped in, reading my face before I spoke. "They're out there," I said. 3 riders' rifles in hand. His expression didn't change much, but the way he set his jaw told me all I needed to know. We roused Owen, who was already half awake, and the 3 of us took positions. Owen near the barn, Matthew inside the chapel doorway, me at the corner of the garden fence where I could see the slope. Naomi refused to stay inside. She stood near the well, close enough to get the children to cover if the first shot came. The night stretched thin, every creak of wood and shift of wind loud against the silence. Around the 3rd hour, the riders moved in closer, stopping at the dry wash. One dismounted, walking forward on foot, slow and deliberate. I could hear the crunch of dry grass under his boots. I sighted along the barrel, not to fire, but to make sure he saw the glint of metal. He stopped short, the moon catching the pale edge of his face. We held there, neither side speaking. Then he turned, mounted up, and the 3 of them rode back toward the ridge. We kept our watch until the first light bled into the sky. The yard felt different in daylight. Children laughing by the pump, the smell of breakfast drifting from the kitchen, but the air still carried a thread of tension. Matthew joined me by the fence. "They'll be back," he said quietly. "Men like that don't give up on a place they've marked." Naomi came over, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "We can't pack up the children and run every time a trouble comes close," she said. Her eyes were steady on mine. "They need to see we'll stand." I knew she was right, but I also knew the fence, the walls. Even our rifles could only do so much if those men decided to press harder. The day wore on with work as usual, repairs to the chicken coop, lessons under the cottonwood, but I kept checking the ridge. By late afternoon, Owen had ridden out to scout. When he returned at dusk, the look on his face was enough to still every voice in the yard. "They've set up camp in the same place," he said. "And this time, they've got more horses with them." By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, every tool had been put away, and the yard was quiet. The children stayed close to the main buildings, their game subdued, while Naomi kept them busy with chores that didn't take them far from the porch. Father Matthew and Owen met me behind the barn to go over the plan for the night. The 3 riders from before had doubled their number, and their campfires were burning bright enough to see from the far slope. We agreed to keep a watch in shifts, Owen at the garden fence, Matthew near the chapel, and me on the rise beyond the well, where I'd have a clear view toward the basin. Naomi wanted to stay out, but I convinced her to take the smaller children into the chapel once it got dark. She didn't argue, but the set of her shoulders told me she didn't like it. The first hour passed with nothing more than the creak of wood cooling in the night air and the low murmur of voices from the chapel. The moon climbed higher, throwing pale light over the ridge. That's when I saw them, 5 riders this time, moving at a slow walk along the edge of the basin. They stayed far enough to keep out of rifle range, but close enough for me to see the glint of metal in their hands. They stopped at the dry wash again, sitting their horses, while one of them pointed toward the mission. I stayed low behind the fence post, watching. A minute later, they wheeled their mounts and rode back the way they'd come, vanishing into the dark. I didn't like it. Men who take the time to look a place over twice aren't passing through by chance. When my shift ended, Owen relieved me on the rise. I tried to sleep in the small bunk room off the kitchen, but every faint sound carried through the boards, hoofbeats that might have been deer, a gate hinge creaking in the wind, the call of a night bird. Just before dawn, Matthew came in to say they were gone. No tracks leading closer than the wash, no sign of them on the ridge. The day came up bright and cloudless, but the tension stayed. Naomi led the older girls into the garden, her voice steady as she explained the work, though I could see her eyes drifting toward the hills. I spent the morning in the barn loft, checking every knot in the rope ladder and making sure the grain sacks could be pulled over as cover if it came to it. By midday, Owen rode out to see if he could trail them. He returned late in the afternoon with news that set the whole place on edge. They'd moved their camp farther east, closer to the old stage road. That puts them with a straight line to here, he said, dust streaking his face from the ride. Matthew called everyone into the yard. The children clustered together while he explained calm but clear that we might have visitors in the next day or two. You'll stay where you're told, and you'll do as you're asked, he said, his voice carrying just enough weight to make them nod. Naomi stood nearby, her presence alone enough to quiet the smaller ones. When the meeting broke, I found myself by the garden fence looking out toward the ridge. The sun was low again, the light turning the grass to copper. I could almost make out the faintest rise of smoke against the horizon. Tomorrow or the next day, those men would come. And when they did, I'd be standing here, same as now, ready to meet them. The next morning broke quiet with a thin mist clinging to the grass. By the time the sun burned it off, the riders were coming down from the ridge. 6 of them now moving slow, their eyes fixed on the mission. Father Matthew stood near the chapel steps, Owen by the barn, with a rifle laid across the fence rail. I was at the garden fence, the wood solid under my hand. Naomi stayed in the yard with the older children, keeping them close, but not letting them see fear. The riders pulled up at the edge of the dry wash. Their leader, a heavy-set man with a battered hat, called out that they were looking for food, water, and anything else worth taking. His voice carried a confidence that came from getting what he wanted before. Matthew stepped forward, answering calm but firm, telling them there'd be no handouts taken by threat. The man laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. One of his riders shifted in the saddle, his hand brushing the stock of his rifle. I leveled mine across the fence, the motion plain enough to catch their attention. Owen mirrored me from the barn. The standoff held in the dry morning air, both sides weighing the other. Finally, the leader spat in the dust and jerked his chin toward the ridge. "Ain't worth it," he said, and turned his horse. The rest followed their hooves, fading into the distance. Only when the last rider vanished from sight did the tightness ease from my chest. The children went back to their chores, but the way they stayed near the main yard told me they understood what had just passed. Matthew came over, laying a hand on my shoulder. "Sometimes standing firm is enough," he said. Naomi joined us, her eyes on the ridge. "And sometimes," she added, "it's knowing you're not standing alone." In the days that followed, the smoke on the horizon never returned. Life at the mission settled back into its rhythm: gardens, tended fences, mended lessons under the cottonwood. I worked alongside the children, teaching them to set a post straight, to tie a knot that would hold in any weather. The ache that had lived in my chest for years was still there, but it no longer kept me from breathing deep. I'd come to this place thinking I was only passing through. Now, when I looked at the chapel, the gardens, the people moving about their work, I knew I'd found somewhere worth staying. Out here on this patch of land between the hills and the sky, I wasn't just a man keeping to himself. I was part of something that needed me. If you've ever found a place or a person that reminded you life can begin again, hold on to it. And if you've got a story like that, I'd like to hear it.